don't think any of us understand how the Otsutsuki work. Well, until right now. See, talking about the beginning of the Naruto universe has been a relatively hot talking point on this channel of late. See, because ever since the Otsutsuki were introduced into the Naruto universe, serious questions have begun to be asked about where the Otsutsuki came from, what the beginning of the universe looked like, why the Otsutsuki feel the need to pop from earth to earth, turning them into chakra fruits and consuming them for power. And a lot of those questions have been answered. However, one very, very important question does absolutely linger. And that question is, where did the Otsutsuki come from? And why do they all seem so trapped in this cycle of needing to turn planets into chakra fruits? Why isn't there somebody amongst them who feels as though they don't need to be defined by this cycle? Even though a lot of the ninjas in the Naruto world were evil, a big talking point in Naruto is the fact that Naruto is trying to break the cycle of war that dictated how humans interacted with each other. And yet, even though we've been introduced to 5+ Otsutsukis, not a single one of them has ever shown anything even remotely close to sympathy for humanity, with the possible exception being Kaguya. But the more that we learned about her backstory, the more it seemed as though she was using humanity to build her own army to fight back against the Otsutsukis because she rallied against their hierarchical power system. And thus, while trying to figure out the true meaning behind why the Otsutsuki do what they do, I and a person by the name of Jason Schmitter, who emailed me, found ourselves not only asking the question, why do the Otsutsuki do what they do, but also, where did they come from? There has to be some kind of origin story to this massively powerful alien race, this parasitic universe-wide problem. And as we thought about this problem, we realized that we have enough info to answer it. However, we didn't have access to the requisite amount of information until very recently. See, because while we've had some grasp of an idea of the relationship between the Ten Tails and the Otsutsuki for a while now, the final piece of the puzzle that allows us to finally unlock the origin story of the oldest race of beings in the entire universe lies with the Shinju, who I believe are the natural evolutionary successors of the Otsutsuki. Yes, what I'm saying is that the Shinju were not a bug, but a feature. Tens of thousands of years in the making, and that the Shinju ironically represent what the Otsutsuki have been trying to accomplish for tens of thousands of years. Enlightenment. All this is to say that we have enough evidence from Naruto Shippuden and Boruto combined to draw a well-founded evolutionary line from the Ten Tails to the Shinju. And by drawing that line, we're able to cobble together what is essentially the creation myth of the Naruto universe. From first being to newest being. Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen, because today we are talking the beginning of the Naruto universe explained. So usually in the beginning of a creation myth, there is nothing, and then there is something. For Pokemon, a singular egg popped out of nothingness, and that was the egg of Arceus, who was then born and became everything in the universe. In Christianity, God said, "Let there be light," and then built the world over the course of 7 days. And in our own scientific explanation of the beginning of the universe, the Big Bang, which we're able to prove happened, but not able to prove why, occurred, resulting in the infinite expansion of the universe.
Oh, Nick, how can you prove the Big Bang happened?
Well, we can track that the universe is getting larger every single day by measuring our distance from other celestial bodies, and then comparing how far we were from those celestial bodies a month, a year, 10 years, 1,000 years ago. Okay, maybe not 1,000 years ago. We couldn't really do it 1,000 years ago, but you get it. But also we can read the cosmic radiation of the universe, deduce how it flows backwards, and draw that back to a single originating point, which was the Big Bang. Anyways, unfortunately, the creation myth that we're able to cobble together today does not go all the way back to the beginning of the universe, but rather it goes back to the beginning of life. See, the beginning of life is also a hotly debated topic. How did life start on Earth, many people ask. And while some people believe that God made a man and then ripped out one of his ribs to make a woman, well, you know, he could have just made a woman. Scientists have a myriad of plausible explanations to explain how life began on Earth. The existence of tardigrades or space bears and their ability to live in the vacuum of space seems to prove that there is a possibility that if a comet were to strike Earth, the living things on that comet could possibly move onto the Earth and then seed life, implying that humanity in some sense is actually a life form that originated from a different planet or a different universe, while other theories state that the massive pressure and water systems and heat of a very, like 4.5 billion years ago planet was actually enough to simply create a single cell eukaryote, a theory that actually has been backed up by scientific evidence, and then that single cell eukaryote was eventually able to consume another single cell eukaryote and turn that single cell eukaryote into an organelle, kind of like a mitochondria, and then we got multicellular organisms, and from there the evolutionary process continued, and so on and so forth. There are a bunch of different possible ways to explain how life could have began on Earth 4.5 billion years ago, not 10,000 years ago. We have carbon dating. things existed before 10,000 years ago. Just because you don't understand how carbon dating works doesn't mean it's not real. Anyways, the important thing to take away from all of this is that the conventionally accepted upon theory as to how life began on Earth is either a comet that brought some single-cell eukaryotes that were able to survive in the vacuum of space, or that the intense ecosystem of a primordial Earth 4.6 billion years ago was able to essentially spawn life. And if you're wondering as to why we're talking about how life began on our Earth, well, it's important to note that Ikimoto is kind of a science nerd, and Kishimoto, ever since the conclusion of Naruto, has been trying to incorporate more sci-fi elements into Boruto. Kishimoto has very notably been trying to write a sci-fi story his entire life. Both Ikimoto and Kishimoto are big into science. This is why Naruto's strongest ever form is named after baryons, a subatomic particle that falls under the typing of a hadron. To know that kind of stuff, you have to understand, at the very least, a little bit of quantum mechanics. And if you understand a little bit of quantum mechanics, you definitely understand biology and evolution. Biology is the easiest of the hard sciences. And thus, Ikimoto and Kishimoto's willingness to incorporate science elements into their story seems to imply that if they were going to do some type of creation myth, it would probably follow the lines of a standard evolutionary practice of how we believe life started in our universes. And there's evidence to support this idea. See, if we assume that the evolutionary process of the Otsutsuki takes them from a Ten-Tails to an Otsutsuki to a Shinju, then that means the beginning of life of possibly the oldest species in the entire universe begins with being a Ten-Tails. And this makes a fair amount of sense. See, the Ten-Tails is a being of pure energy. When Naruto reaches out to the Ten-Tails as a sensor in the 4th Great Shinobi World War and hopes to communicate with it to get it to stop raging and destroying the entire battlefield, what Naruto realizes is that the Ten-Tails has no consciousness, no ego. It is simply a convulsing mass of nature energy, an entity born into this world to terraform planets. And ironically, in that sense, it aligns very much with the Freudian idea of id. See, Freud was a philosopher, and he had a couple of pretty wacky ideas, mostly revolving around wanting to sleep with his own mother. However, regardless of how large his Oedipus complex was, his breakdown of human consciousness falling into 3 buckets is still pretty conventionally agreed upon to be the most accurate model. And those 3 buckets are the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, if you'll notice in our evolutionary model of the Otsutsuki, there's also 3 buckets: the Ten-Tails, the Otsutsuki, and the Shinju. And boy oh boy, is there some connections between these buckets. So you've already established that the Ten-Tails are seemingly a representation of id. They are pure, bestial instinct. A Ten-Tail's sole purpose is to consume chakra and genetic material, whether that be by consuming an Otsutsuki and turning into a divine tree and taking the roots of said divine tree into a planet and sapping that planet of all of its chakra and turning that into a chakra fruit that's later consumed by an Otsutsuki, or wrapping up every single living being on a planet and slowly seeping all of their power back into its roots. A Ten-Tail's purpose is to consume, and that's it. It doesn't think, it doesn't want, it seeks. This falls into the categorization of id because id is the primitive, instinctual part of the personality, which operates entirely in your unconscious mind. It's driven by pleasure seeking and immediate gratification. It tells you when you're hungry, horny, or angry. It doesn't think of social norms or consequences. If you were governed by your id and your id alone, you'd be like an untrained dog who's seen its owner leave their cooked dinner on a place it can reach, with no thoughts of the societal norms or the consequences. You eat that cooked dinner because to you it's food, it's been made, it's there's nothing stopping you. And that is what the Ten-Tails represent. And at no point of the story is this further established than in Two Blue Vortex with the introduction of the Claw Grimes. See, because the Claw Grimes, which are effectively just slivers of a juvenile Ten-Tails, are completely dictated by the most instinctual part of their brain and nothing else. They seek out Otsutsuki to consume. However, because they don't know who is an Otsutsuki and who isn't, they bite anybody they have the chance of biting, leading to the majority of the Claw Grimes biting people who aren't Otsutsukis and growing into malformed divine trees, unable to achieve their one biological driver. This is very similar to the Pure Titans in the Attack on Titan universe, as the Pure Titans are Eldians who have had Titan serum injected into them, and therefore the reason that they constantly are trying to consume humans is because there's a possibility that one of the humans they consume is a Titan shifter, and therefore after consuming that Titan shifter, even though they'll only survive another 13 years, they will be able to return to being human. And the Claw Grimes operate in almost an identical principle, except instead of turning into a human, they get to do the one thing that they are technically biologically driven to do, which is turning into a divine tree, which allows for them to consume the chakra of an entire planet. See, the Otsutsuki operate as a key to a door that is an almost infinite chakra source. By consuming an Otsutsuki, a Ten-Tails gets to achieve the highest form of biological drive. And while this does technically, so far as we know, lead to the death of the Ten-Tails in question, this speaks to the primal chaos, the id aspect of it all. See, the Ten-Tails, if they had the ability to think, would understand that the consumption of an Otsutsuki would lead to the end of their life. And even though before their life technically ended and the chakra fruit they produced was plucked, they would have access to more chakra than they ever could have dreamed imaginable. The other parts of our consciousness that check our id would have understood that the access to that amount of chakra is not worth dying. And therefore, in this evolutionary ladder, the Ten-Tails represent the raw force of existence before intelligence and morality develop. However, some of you are probably asking right now, but Nick, if we're assuming that the Ten-Tails are the primordial life forces of the universe, beings of pure nature energy that were symbolic representations of the energy of the planets that they existed on in the first place, much akin to how life is theorized to have begun on this planet, then how did the Otsutsuki ever come to be? I mean, while we understand that the Otsutsuki and the Ten-Tails seem to have a somewhat symbiotic relationship, where the Ten-Tails very seemingly wants to turn into a divine tree, and the Otsutsuki wants the Ten-Tails to turn into a divine tree so they can consume the chakra fruit that's made from said tree, are you implying that somehow, some way, the Ten-Tails turned into the Otsutsuki? Yeah, actually I am. See, while the relationship between the Ten-Tails and the Otsutsuki is fuzzy at best, Kaguya's backstory tells us that they have the ability to be one. This is only further backed up by Hagoromo's existence and the existence of literally all the Jinchuriki in Naruto, as technically every chakra-bearing human on Earth is a descendant of Kaguya, and therefore slightly Otsutsuki. And thus this connection between the Otsutsuki and the Ten-Tails seems almost biological, to the point where when Kaguya was first introduced in Naruto Shippuden, she was often referred to as the Ten-Tails herself. See, because when Kaguya took the Ten-Tails inside of her, she was able to simply assume the form of the Ten-Tails, which is the form that Hagoromo and Hamura had to battle against for 3 months until eventually they were able to pull the Ten-Tails out of Kaguya and then seal her. And it wasn't until the energy of the Ten-Tails was sealed inside of Hagoromo that the husk of the Geto statue was created and sent to the moon. But if Kaguya could be referred to as the Ten-Tails and exist as the Ten-Tails, like I said, this seems to imply some sort of either chakra-based or genetic connection. And thus this theory stipulates that when a Ten-Tails consumes enough chakra, it eventually is able to undergo a transformation into an Otsutsuki. And the way that this could happen is very similar to the way that we believe we got multicellular organisms, which is that at one point in time, one singular cell organism consumed another singular cell organism and turned it into an organelle with a function that allowed for that previously singular celled organism to complete more complicated processes. And therefore, there's a possibility that maybe when a Ten-Tails consumes another Ten-Tails, it's able to become an Otsutsuki. And when you consider the fact that a Ten-Tails needs to consume an Otsutsuki to be able to turn into a divine tree and create a chakra fruit, this idea of advancement through consumption is nothing new to the Otsutsuki lineage. And therefore, when a Ten-Tails consumes enough chakra, it's able to gain self-awareness and intelligence by forming itself into that of an Otsutsuki, bumping itself one step further down the evolutionary timeline from id to ego. See, ego is a part of your consciousness, not your subconsciousness. Developed during your childhood, it is the rational part of your personality, acting as a mediator between id's demands and the external world, trying to satisfy your id's deep desires in a way that abides by society's rules. You're hungry? Cool. You can't eat your friend's food because they cooked it, but maybe you could ask them for a little bit, or maybe you could make yourself some food. You're horny? Well, you can't just grab the nearest woman and try what you want to try. Maybe download a dating app. The ego considers societal norms and consequences. It plans out how to achieve the wants of the id. But at the end of the day, it is still dictated by the id. See, because while the ego acts as a mediator between the id and the real life world, as a mediator, it is employed by the id. And this is exactly how the Otsutsuki work. See, the Otsutsuki plan and strategize and seek power in a structured way. They go from planet to planet with the Ten-Tails, and they find powerful life forms, and then they destroy those planets, and they feed their lower ranked Otsutsuki to a Ten-Tails, create a divine tree, and consume a chakra fruit. Fundamentally, what they're achieving is no different from what they were doing as Ten-Tails. They are seeking power, they're just now doing it with consciousness. Even though they're intelligent and view themselves as the gods of the universe, they remain trapped in a cycle of consumption, planting divine trees, harvesting chakra fruits, and moving to the next planet. There appears to be no additional thought to an Otsutsuki outside of the consumption of planets, and therefore, while they're rational, their main goal is still power, and survival. They haven't made it to the top of the needs pyramid. Well, yes, they all consume these chakra fruits with the idea that eventually one day they'll be able to assume true godhood as a wall of Jogan eyes. This singular end goal of transcendence keeps them in a perpetual cycle of their most primal instincts thinly veiled with a sheet of intelligence. And therefore the Otsutsuki represent ambition and control. However, they're not enlightened beings, and rather just intelligent predators. They're like African wild dogs or wolves. The establishment of a pack and hunting principles to better the chances of food for the entire pack does not make you an enlightened being. It simply means you figured out how to best optimize survival. Which brings us to the Shinju, the true, actual final evolutionary stopping point for the Otsutsuki. See, even the formation of the Shinju seems to imply that they are an evolutionary step above the Otsutsuki. See, because the only reason that the Shinju ever came into being is because Code imbued Ten Tails with the Shinjutsu of Shibai with his claw marks. See, by slicing off parts of the Ten Tails to create the claw grimes and then giving them claw marks seemed to jumpstart some kind of evolutionary response amongst these now much smaller Ten Tails. See, because while the claw grimes themselves were only dictated by their id, simply wanting to bite into anything or anybody they could find in hopes that they were finding an Otsutsuki, the result of this id dictating them to bite into anything created the Shinju, entities that seemingly go beyond even the Otsutsuki in terms of intelligence and enlightenment. See, in the manga, Shibai is constantly talked about as somebody who has achieved nirvana. By consuming hundreds, if not thousands of chakra fruits, Jura has been able to transcend his own physical body, existing in a dimension alone as a god. And thus the injection of the Shinjutsu from a person of this level of power may explain why people like Jura seem so incredibly uninterested in the consumption of anything and anybody. See, because while all of the Shinju do want to consume at least one person, with Jura wanting to consume Himawari, Hidari wanting to consume Sarada, Bug Shinju wanting to consume Ada, and so on and so forth, these were all conclusions that the Shinju had to think about and come to. Best dictated to us when Boruto first came face to face with the Shinju in the earliest chapters of Two Blue Vortex, where Boruto was put in an incredibly disadvantageous situation as Jura was floating down to him, explaining to him how he could kill him at any moment. But because he's more driven by unlocking the secrets of this earth rather than giving into his primal instincts of consumption over everything, that Boruto could go, essentially. And thus the Shinju have displayed a level of intelligence and enlightenment that goes far beyond anything the Otsutsukis have ever accomplished. See, the Shinju don't want to consume the people they want to consume because they believe it'll give them power. The Shinju want to consume the people they want to consume because they believe it'll unlock the secrets of their existence. They don't understand why they're being biologically pulled towards the people they are, but they're assuming that by consuming the people that they're biologically pulled to, that will answer the lingering questions that they have about their own existence. They're not worried about survival, they're worried about living. And this right here is why the Shinju are such a good representation of Freud's model of the superego. See, superego is your internalized moral consciousness. It dictates what we believe is morally right and morally wrong, pushing us to follow ethical standards and strive for moral perfection. It's because of the superego that we can feel guilt. And while I'm not sitting here and saying that the Shinju experience guilt for any of the things they've done up until this moment, the talk of the human side of the Shinju and the emotions that they experience being a weakness that they need to cut out of themselves all but proves that the Shinju are further along in the evolutionary cycle, at least from a psychological standpoint, than the Otsutsuki have ever been. Because while Otsutsuki like Kaguya have been stated to be able to feel love, one, we don't understand the full validity of Kaguya's backstory. Two, any and all backstory we did get about her life with Tenzo and the making of Hamura and Hagoromo and how everything went wrong on her is technically anime only. And three, the chakra fruit that she consumed was technically grown from Earth, which most likely contains the energy and DNA of Shibai, which could be a possible explanation as to why she is the only Otsutsuki seems to have some capacity for emotional intelligence. Though obviously she did fall in love with Tenzo before she consumed the chakra fruit on Earth. It's Tenji. I don't know why I've been calling him Tenzo recently. And thus, as we watch Matsuri experience things like love and hatred as she falls for Konohamaru but realize that he's betrayed her, and we watch Ryu try to befriend all of the ninjas he's walking around with until they betray him, it's becoming more and more increasingly clear that the Shinju have a capacity for intelligence and emotion that no other Otsutsuki related being has ever had, essentially breaking themselves free from the Otsutsuki's endless pursuit of consumption-based power. And while the Shinju are still technically trying to destroy the world, they aren't trying to consume all of the Earth's chakra in the form of a chakra fruit and delete all living beings. It's just that they understand that they may be the next step in the evolutionary process process, and that they, as the most evolved and powerful beings on Earth, should be the ones to inhabit it. It's much akin to how Homo sapiens eradicated all Neanderthals as the more evolved, more intelligent species. Instead of consuming for survival, the Shinju are creating and exploring and studying, representing transcendence. The emergence of a being that's no longer shackled by its intentions, a being capable of conscious thoughts that aren't dictated by hunger, thirst, or a sex drive. And the reason we've never seen this level of evolution up until this moment in time is because the only Otsutsuki to ever achieve transcendence through what they identify as their only means of transcendence, the consumption of thousands of chakra fruits, had their DNA mixed with the first step of the evolutionary chain, the Ten Tails, and thus the resulting beings that were made were those who had the transcendent ideology, but not the power of Shibai. And I don't know about you, but that makes a lot of sense to me. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. How do you believe the Naruto universe came into being? Do you think the Ten Tails, the Otsutsuki, and the Shinju are all connected through some great evolutionary path, or do you think that science is all made up mumbo jumbo? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you excuse me, I have to go shave my arm hair because it's the summertime and I'm gonna show off my tattoos.